Just want to wish you all a warm welcome to this first breakfast conversation in a new series called In the Wake of Democracy, a series of new forms of dictatorships. This event will look at especially presidential term limits, and we'll focus on one of the topics of this breakfast series of Bergen Global, that will look at how institutions and constitutions are twisted and turned so as to help dictator-prone or power-interested, power-hungry leaders to win more power and weaken democracy. So we will look at today one special issue, one special clause in constitutions, especially in presidential regimes in Africa and Latin America. Those are presidential term limits, which really restrict the time a president, an elected president, can serve in power before he or she has to leave power and assure alternability. And if observed, term limits can really put a check on power in democracies, but we know that term limits is also a cause for political conflict in many of the countries and are prone to be reformed by often authoritarian-minded leaders. Here today to discuss this topic with us, we have two researchers from the GIGA Institute in Hamburg, Mariana Llanos and Charlotte Heyl, who both have contributed with chapters in this recent book called The Politics of Term Limits, edited by Alexander Baturo and Robert Elgie, out this summer on Oxford University Press. And their regions of expertise are, for Mariana, Latin America, and she has written one chapter on Argentina in this book, and Charlotte with Africa, who has written a chapter on Senegal in this book. So we will be focusing not only on term limits, but in particular on the African and Latin American region, and we will continue to discuss these throughout this morning. We'll, I guess, be talking for around 40 minutes before we open for questions, so I hope to have an engaged audience with questions and comments towards the end, so there will be time for this. But before we go into the more African, Latin American context, I was thinking of starting with you, Mariana, if you could explain to us what are presidential term limits and why do democracies try to implement them in presidential democracies?
Hi, you hear me? Thank you, Leiv. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk on our project on term limits. I have to say that Leiv also has a chapter on that book, historical chapter on Latin American term limits. What are term limits? I think you said a little bit already. We have to remember that these are an element of constitutionalism, an institution that is written in the constitutions to restrain the time the president can stay in power. There are different types of presidential term limits. We want to talk a little bit about that, I guess, later. It's important to remember that they are normally associated with presidential regimes. So we don't see much of those term limits in parliamentary regimes where prime ministers can get re-elected without restrictions, but we do see them very often in presidential regimes. And the arguments are that there are different reasons for that. One reason, for instance, is that the president is directly elected and for a fixed term. So in these different parliamentary regimes where the president can be removed any time during the term because of the vote of censure, and this doesn't happen in a presidential regime, therefore we need some constraints on the time the president's gonna stay. And another reason is that, for instance, that elected presidents have not only direct legitimacy, which is a lot of power, but also many other constitutional powers, like the legislative powers to intervene in the legislative process, and also appointment powers, for instance, and sometimes they are this is too much, and in developing democracies, there is an imbalance of power in favor of the president. So the only way or the best way to constrain their power is to constrain the time they are gonna serve. So these are more or less I would say the main things around the introduction of term limits, which are of course associated with what we could say better democracies and so on. So they have been adopted in the third way of democratization all over the world as an intent to improve the quality, or at least the constitutional quality of those democracies. But as I said, we don't have just one term limit, we have different types, and the effects of these different types can be very different. So I don't know if maybe Charlotte can tell us a little bit on.
Yes, Charlotte, could you tell us a little bit about the types of term limits we see in Africa? Now we know that term limits put an maximum time that the president can serve. Mm-hmm. How does this work in Africa? How do they implement term limits in the African continent?
Yeah, in Africa, we actually have like one standard design for presidential term limits, and this is the two-term limit. So it's like in the US, where also the president is allowed to serve for 2 terms. We only have very few countries who have 3-term limits, and we had like one attempt. 2 years ago, President Talon in Benin, he tried to introduce a 1-term limit. It was his campaign pledge, but he failed to do so. Maybe it was because he also tried to introduce or to increase his presidential powers with this attempt, but there were also arguments that people said, okay, with one presidential term, presidents tend to be less accountable because they do not have to seek re-election anymore, so they can do whatever they want. So Benin stayed with the 2-term limit, the standard design.
Maybe in Latin America it's a little bit different. We have, and you can read Leiv's chapter in that book, we have a long history of term limits since the 19th century, but the standard until the third way of democratization was that presidents couldn't be re-elected immediately. So they could, in some cases, they could come back later, but they had to stay step down for at least a term. And in some cases, they couldn't come back at all. So that was the standard in the 80s when the region came back to democracy. And but now it has changed a little bit, the situation. So we have had many reforms. This has been a world trend that these original constraints on the time on the re-election of the immediate re-election of the president has been revised in many constitutions in different ways, and the situation is a bit different now today than for 40 years before, when these countries came back to democracy.
Yeah. We were mentioning earlier that parliamentary systems do not have term limits. We know from Norway we have a prime minister who is on her 2nd term now. In Germany,
4th.
She's on her 4th term. Angela Merkel has been prime minister for 14 years and counting. And now, I don't know, Charlotte, Mariana, could you tell us a little bit about, within the Latin American or African context, the dangers of not having limits on presidents, what the experiences are in the respective regions, and maybe also then also discuss why we need them in these presidential systems in Africa and Latin America, but we don't seem to need them here in the European parliamentary system. Charlotte, do you want to start?
Yes, I can. So, I mean, Mariana explained already that there are like different logics also in the systems. That in the parliamentary system, actually the prime minister is always accountable to the legislator, which is not the case in presidential systems. And in Africa, we have also this long, or when you start studying African politics, you usually hear about the big man that is ruling the country with personalized rules. He has a lot of power, as Mariana was also explained, to appoint judges and so on. And we have in Africa, there is a history after independence of live presidents. And we also know what we could observe, like the longer people stay in power, the more time they have to consolidate their power. And we also know that incumbents usually get re-elected. So Adam Tversky, for example, he did an analysis of over 2,000 contested presidential elections since the 18th century. And he found that in 70% of these elections, incumbents won the election. So I wouldn't say it's only an African phenomenon, but it's a worldwide phenomenon that incumbents are strong and it's easier for them to stay in power because also people know them. So when they stand for election, it's easier for them to prove their experience in government. They have access to state resources that they can abuse in electoral campaigns, for instance. And they also have more this access to state resources also allows them to distribute positions or other favors. So really to build a solid support network. So
Yes, she said what I could say. But I think the logic is that you, with these institutions, you force the president out of power and give more opportunities to opposition parties, which otherwise wouldn't have the chance to be in power once. And this could this is bad for democracy if there are some forces in society that don't feel that they can get into power at some point in time. Of course, there are criticisms of term limits as well, and for the majoritarian kind of concept of democracy, people would argue that this is a too bold kind of mechanism to produce these quality effects on democracy, to have an institution to stop a president who may still be popular, to don't allow to him to compete in elections because of these institutions. And this has been a strong argument in some of the constitutional reforms in Latin America, where incumbent presidents have argued, okay, look at the opinion polls, I'm still popular, and this is just this constitutional mechanism that doesn't allow me to contest in the next elections. And some presidents have even gone further to argue that it's against the human right of that president to contest on that election as in equal conditions as any other citizen would have the right to contest. So there is a controversy there, but in general, I think there's a lot of work, there is a lot of academic production at the moment on this issue, and I think academics are more or less in accordance that some sort of term limit is important to protect the competition of political parties in the system in the longer run.
Yeah, thank you. And competition, as we know, is key to democracy. Now, you were mentioning a bit of trends earlier, and I wanted to bring in a little bit of trends, what's going on in Latin America and African countries. As you know, many of us are concerned about the global political development. We're talking about democratic backsliding. We're talking about authoritarian revival, democratic backlash, populist presidents are running big countries such as Brazil, the United States, and so on. So we're seeing authoritarian tendencies. And of course, as we've been arguing, term limits, if respected, may be a way to at least say there's a timeline here, there's an end to this presidency, we will see better days. But we also know that power-hungry presidents seek to reform constitutions so that these limits won't hinder re-election. So thinking of starting with you, Mariana, what are the trends in Latin America? What are the changes in terms of term limits in the region? And could we argue that these changes in any way affect democracy in the countries where we've seen changes, either for more relaxed term limits or more limited term limits? So could we link some of these things we see with the change of term limits to these more broader developments of backsliding, for instance, of democracies?
Yes, there have been many reforms concerning this. As Leiv said, the president's incumbents are normally the ones that are looking for these changes, are starting these reforms. But as you know, sometimes speaking of Latin America as a whole is a bit misleading, because it's not just one trend in all countries following that trend. There are many instances in between. So you have the countries that haven't done any reform at all since the 80s. And you have the countries that have reformed all the time. And you have, within those countries with many reforms, you have those that have reformed always in the same direction. So each time a step further in the direction of more time for the president. So you have countries like Venezuela, we could say, where Venezuela is not, maybe Bolivia is a better example, where you could, we have many reforms, and they started with just one re-election, then they did something else to allow the president to stay for one more term, and then they at the end the indefinite re-election won. But then you have other countries that have done a lot of reforms, like the Dominican Republic, and not always in the same direction, but forth and backwards and forth and backwards and so on. And then you have countries like Argentina, where there was a big discussion in the 90s, and the immediate re-election of the president came in a package of many other reforms, but that was, and the discussion established in those years, and then there was nothing else. There was a little bit, but not much than that. So there are some countries today in Latin America, which are Nicaragua, Honduras, Venezuela, and Bolivia, right? I forget, that allowed the indefinite re-election. So they are the only ones. And you could see there is a kind of association in the type of democracy you have in those countries and this indefinite re-election. There have been many waves of change, constitutional change, and for some reason they landed in that type of term limit. In other countries, it hasn't been the case. What comes first, if the problem are the term limits, or the problem is the political regime that pre-existed or that was at the moment of the constitutional reform, is something that the political scientists discuss a lot. It's called the endogeneity problem. Because these reforms happen one after the other, then the conditions of the political regime are some before the reform, and they change afterwards, and they affect the next reform, and so on. So, but there is a relation between the quality of the regime and the type of controls or constraints on the presidential term that we have. I don't want to speak so much, so I leave the word because I could say something else. But
Come
no. Let's something on Africa first. And
Okay, yeah. So in Africa, so at the beginning of the 1990s, when the so-called third wave of democratization swept to Africa, many term limits, or in most countries, 2-term limits were introduced. And since then, we can observe many reforms. Like Mariana and I, we have a project, and for Africa, we counted since the early 1990s, 48 reforms. But these are like reforms in both directions. It's not only the elimination of term limits, but also the introduction. And then it's, I would say it's similar to Latin America. So there's not one African trend, but they are like different trajectories that the countries follow. So we have some very stable cases. So for example, Ghana and Benin, where there the term limit is respected and electoral turnovers occurred regularly. And these are also the countries that are usually known as the most democratic, or among the most democratic countries in Africa. And then we also have a group that abolished term limits at one point in time, and they did not reintroduce it anymore. So, and these are authoritarian regimes like Cameroon or Gabon that also have like really long time leaders. And we also have some countries where it's going back and forth between abolishing and reintroducing or trying to circumvent the term limit, for instance, Burkina Faso and Senegal. And then we also have some authoritarian regimes who recently reintroduced term limits, and this is, for example, Chad. Chad reintroduced last year a term limit, and also Togo, they introduced this year a term limit. And in both cases, in Chad, Idriss Déby is ruling the country since 1990, and in Togo, Gnassingbé, he rules the country only since 2005, but his father used to rule the country since 1967, so it's in the hand of its family. And in Togo, it was also a reaction to very, like the whole last year, or since 1.5 years roughly, there were very big demonstrations demanding further democratization and constitutional reform. So he introduced a term limit, but it does not apply retrospectively. So the same in Chad. So they have introduced term limits, but they still have the chance to rule for another 2 terms. And I think this shows also something interesting about term limits, because term limits, they are very easy to understand. Like it's everybody, it's easy to catch the notion that it signals that people want to leave. And so I think it's also a good device to communicate either to the domestic audience or also to the international audience, to say, yes, here we are willing to do some reform and I'm planning to leave. But then the good thing about term limits is that they do not apply immediately. So you don't have to leave immediately power. And this also gives people the time to wait. And maybe in 2 or 3 years, things have changed a little bit and they will find a way to circumvent again the term limit. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We mentioned now there's been some changes. But Mariana, you also mentioned that, for instance, and I know this from the Honduran case, there was the Supreme Court interpreted the Constitution in such a way that they said that we could not have any term limits in this country because it would be the violation of the human rights of our president. He would then not be allowed to stand for election. And we know there are many ways to change a constitution. And I forgot to mention this in the introduction, but you've mentioned it. You have this marvelous data set on term limit change in Latin America and in Africa. And one of the key things that you focus on, how do they change term limits? And I want to ask you, any of you, how are term limits being changed? And does the way term limits are changed, does it matter for democracy?
Yeah. Sure.
Mariana, Charlotte, any of you?
The easy answer is yes.
Yeah. And now the more complicated one.
Yeah. So we are on the way of building this data set where we look at each of those about 50 episodes and see how the process of reforming that constitutional attribute. And there are many differences, of course. And in some cases, the constitutional process to reform the constitution is followed nicely. In other process, it isn't, and there are new kind of ideas of how to do that that come. And then we talk a little bit about we try to code the level of legality. So we talk about legality and inclusiveness in our project, and see if these reforms comply to the standards. And you see a lot of variation there, of course, and maybe because we were talking yesterday in the cities course about a little bit about that. We have elections coming now in October in 3 countries in Latin America. Is Argentina and Uruguay on the same day, 27th of October, and then we have Bolivia a week earlier. And these 3 countries are quite interesting because they have had a different kind of path of regarding the term limits discussion. So Uruguay, is one of the model democracies in the region. It didn't touch the term limits. No attempts to reform, and so it remains like that since decades. Then you had the case of Argentina, which is a kind of good democracy as well. It has a lot of problems. I'm from Argentina, so I can. But in that sense, we could say there was a big reform in the 90s, and the issue is more or less solved. And they come up from time to time kind of discussions, but it was a model kind of constitutional reform in the sense that all the paths of the reform were followed. The Congress intervened first, and then they named they had elections for a constitutional assembly, and the constitutional assembly decided on the new constitution. And the term limit that resulted from that process was to concede the incumbent president, who was very ambitious, the immediate re-election, but not indefinite re-election. So he had to step out, and then the president can come back, but has to step out after the second term. And then you have the interesting case of Bolivia, where there wasn't any term limit until 2009, where this huge constitutional reform took place, and many things changed in that country. And then you had 2 interventions of the constitutional courts. The first one to interpret if the new term of Evo Morales after that big constitutional reform was part of the new system or was part of the old system, which was it's a typical court intervention also in other countries. And that in that case, the court decided he could stand as a new beginning a new term with a new constitution. Then there was a referendum that President Morales lost because the population decided they didn't want to reform the constitution again, to let President Evo Morales run again. And then, but 2 years later, the president didn't like, of course, that decision, and asked the Constitutional Court again, and Constitutional Court allowed him to run.
Yeah, because the referendum said
no
to his re-election.
Exactly, he lost the referendum, but he had arguments because unfairness of the campaign, of so on. So there are always arguments, and then he asked the Constitutional Court, and then the Constitutional Court says he can run again. So these interventions of the courts have been very controversial, but we have many cases of that, and Charlotte can tell as well from Africa. And this was one of the things that led us to study the 2 regions together, because we saw kind of similar reform paths, not such similar, but kind of things that were comparable between the 2 regions. So maybe you can tell, I don't know, something on the African.
Yeah. Yes, I can. Maybe like what we see in our data set is maybe that most African cases they prefer to take it the simple way, I would say, and the simple way is to simply vote a constitutional amendment in the National Assembly, and this can be the simple way when presidents and many African presidents are in the situation that they have a stable majority or even supermajority in the National Assembly or in Parliament, and this is due because also the electoral system just engineered in a way that they can acquire easily these majorities, and then they vote in the parliament, and then it depends. Sometimes they have open debates, but there are also cases, for example, in Senegal in '98, where they did this in an extraordinary session, and it was announced really on short notice, so the opposition did not even know about that the session is actually taking place. So, of course, it's difficult then to oppose the reform. Then also, another way is to trying to circumvent the rule, not really changing the rule, but circumvent it. And this is usually done by arguing that the first terms did not count under the presidential term limit, and then you go to the court and to put it simply, asked for such an interpretation. And this is, you could also say that courts can be controlled quite easily because like in an extreme case, like in Senegal, the president appoints all 5 constitutional judges, so already he has quite an influence about the composition. But also in other cases, sometimes they have to do like more heavy-handed behavior. For instance, in Burundi, it was like in 2015, it was, for example, the vice president of the Constitutional Court that was fleeing the country before the court had to decide whether Nkurunziza is allowed to run again, and he said he was fleeing the country because he received death threats that they have to decide for. They have to allow Nkurunziza to run again. Or in Niger, for example, in 2009, the president did not manage to get the amendment through in Parliament. Also, the Constitutional Court did not allow him to hold a referendum, and then he simply dissolved the institutions and made his new constitution. But in the end, a coup d'état happened, and this was the end of the project. And but there's also like advanced ways of playing with the institutions, and this would be the Rwanda case, where Kagame he used like a wide array of instruments. So he prepared already very well his extended stay in power. So there were first some MPs asking to stay in power. Then there was a petition that 60% of the Rwandans voters signed. But there were also some reports that these people were actually intimidated. And then he used several institutions like Parliament, Senate, and then in the end a referendum. And this is also a way to showcase your legitimacy. So because he used all these institutions, and actually legally you cannot criticize it, like when you have a very narrow legal approach.
Yes, following up on this, and in this book and else, there's written a lot about term limits. But I know in particular that one thing that we haven't discussed that much either in literature that we read or else, that presidents really do want to get re-elected. But what do people say about these things? And I know that Afrobarometer, in contrast to Latino Barometer, which is surveys in Africa, they actually ask people about what they think about term limits. As I said, presidents, we know their attitude towards term limits, but what are people's attitudes? Because they may mobilize them in a referendum, but that does not even always express the real feelings of people. So, Charlotte, if you could entertain us with some numbers.
Yes. Afrobarometer in the latest round, like 74% of the respondents supported term limits, and this is actually a trend that was also present in the last rounds. And it's also interesting, for example, I mentioned already the case of Burundi, and while the discussions about the term limit circumventions were going on, there were 2 rounds of Afrobarometer surveys were going on. And in the first survey, like 51% of the people supported term limits. But 2 years later, so while the discussions were going on, it increased to 62% of the people, or the respondents supporting term limits. So there's actually a contradiction between these surveys saying that people support it and what the presidents say. No.
We've talked now a bit about these presidents that have been able to reform, but the title for this talk was "Who Can Stop the President?" And we know there are many cases of reform, of relaxing reforms, and we also know there are many cases of reforms where things have been restricted. But we know also from Latin America lately we've had attempts in Colombia of relaxing term limits, in Paraguay of relaxing term limits, in Dominican Republic. Maybe one could count Argentina in that list, where the presidents haven't been successful. And I'm sure there have been many examples also in the African context where presidents try to relax term limit, but they end up not being all that powerful. They don't manage to. So in these cases or in other cases, what stops the president? Why? What is it that really stops presidents from having success to reform the constitution and become re-elected and remove any limits on their terms?
It's really important to mention that, because we could have the impression, if we look only at the successful reforms, that presidents always get their way. But we count also in our project the unsuccessful attempts to do these reforms, and there are quite a few in both regions. And it is difficult to say a general pattern, but there are always these institutions that sometimes, as I mentioned, may facilitate the way for the president to stay in power. Sometimes they may be totally against the president. You have presidents who have failed referendums. For instance, Panama is a country where you don't have any reforms, but there are many attempts, and the president have even lost referendums, and they try and doesn't work, and in any data set, Panama wouldn't show up because it doesn't have any reforms, but there have been the attempts. And in that case, it has been the referendum or the strength of the opposition that have stopped the presidents. In other cases, like the Colombian case, it was the courts that stopped the president in the very, very last attempt. And then the Congress voted a new law where no re-election at all is permitted. And so we have, I think, one of the lessons of studying this kind of reforms is how important it is to analyze the context in which all these reforms are occurring, and instead of generalizing or finding quickly kind of patterns, courts are always against, and Congress, presidents that have the Congress always get their way, whatever. So we have to analyze much more carefully the historical past and also the contextual circumstances in which presidents try to this attempt for the reform. Sometimes it's just a political strategy to, because when you come to the end of your term in the United States, they talk about the lame duck, the president that if everyone knows that the president has to leave, then he loses the control of the political situation. But if you open the box of the change of the constitutional change, then you can kind of manipulate a little bit more for a further time. But sometimes they're very serious about that, and sometimes just a political strategy. So in our project, we only quote those cases in which the president undertook an institutional step, not small talk or cheap talk to the public or to the opposition, but those cases in which they reach an institution, and also, I'm talking too much. Also, there is a of course there is a strategy of the president. They sit there and observe which institution is the most, or which political path they want to follow, because not that the constitutions, there is controversy, sometimes they can follow the typical constitutional convention and open a big constitutional reform, but sometimes it happened in Ecuador, for instance, when there is controversy, sometimes not very clear which type in the constitution, which type of reform should go for a full reform or should go through the parliamentary kind of amendment. So they play a little bit with that, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work as they planned.
Could reforming the constitution and removing term limits also be a risk for a president? I know you've been talking a little bit earlier or writing about how, because you mentioned how institutions might stop a president, but it might also cause popular mobilization, right?
Yes, it can. So, so I mentioned the case of Burkina Faso, where President Compaoré, he actually was quite for a long time quite successful to stay in power and to play around with the term limit. But then in when he tried it the last time, this time he did not calculate well, or his plan did not work out because there was already resistance in his own party, and then really strong popular protest evolved. And this protest, interestingly, 2 years ago or 2 years before, there were also big popular protests in Senegal against Abdoulaye Wade's third term bid, and there were also regional connections between the civil society movements teaching each other. So there were really strong popular protests in Burkina Faso, and eventually it was the military who also stepped in, and it was so his last attempt to move the constitution ended in a coup d'etat and the end of his power. So, but this is really also the things, like if the constitutions do not work, I would say it can be like the ruling party itself that stops the president, popular protests, or the military. So,
the military, yeah. I see that the time is. We want to leave some time for questions and answers. I had a couple of more questions, but I think it's more fair to open up for the last 15 minutes for any questions from the audience. Please, if you do have any questions, raise your arm, and will be a microphone coming towards you.
Hello.
Stand up.
There is one word that you haven't mentioned in your presentation, and I don't know if that's because you're very polite or if it's because it's not the term that you use. That is dictator. Mm-hmm. And is that a word used only by the media? Mm-hmm. For instance, there was one of them who was buried in Africa not many days ago, who everybody agreed was a dictator. So, do you have a definition when you become a dictator?
Mm-hmm.
We can take a couple of more questions,
okay.
And then you just take notes, and Lisa, and then 2 more, and then we can take some answers.
So thank you for a very, very interesting conversation. So what I wanted to know, I think you've, and your data set, it sounds very, very interesting. And I think it's probably the main institution that kind of tells us where things are going towards a kind of a dictatorship or democracy. So I think focusing on term limits makes a lot of sense. But I wanted to know, and I think it's probably mostly a question to you, Charlotte. It's what, when you have these term limit debates or changes either in the, that stops the term limits or stops this change from happening, or when it actually changes, do you also see some other changes? Like, for instance, a president, you lose a term limit bid, but does other changes follow? Like, for instance, more or less executive powers. So do you see institutional changes in the wake of these term limit debates?
Yes, I wonder whether you know anything about Uganda. President Museveni has been sitting for quite a few years, and I just wonder whether you could say a little about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Siri or...
She also.
Oh. Oh.
Yeah, that's the idea.
So thank you. This was very, very interesting and thought-provoking. And my question in a way follows on what was said before. I was wondering if you look at the sort of big democracy indicators data sets, like VDAM and the different data sets, that says something about the trends. Is there a systematic variation between sort of term limits, different type of term limits, and sort of democratic development in these countries more generally? I just because I'm curious. And then I was just to the last thing you were saying, Charlotte. I was thinking that you said maybe the constitution doesn't work, but then other things. But maybe that's how the constitution works. So that's also interesting, because constitutions create expectations, and they create expectations within the party, which sort of changes the power dynamics within. They change and in a way, even though it's thoroughly undemocratic for the army to go in a way they go in because there are sort of expectations that this has to do with democracy, maybe.
Yeah,
One final question here in the front, and then we take some answers.
This one?
So fancy. So this is probably a super difficult question, as I know the literature doesn't agree. But which constitutional reforms would you say in your respective regions have been successful? And what type of designing a new constitution, that means legislature or setting down Congress or an assembly to do these changes, what type of design would you say is the best for securing a stable democracy? Because you have many different ways of, for example, changing the constitution or making a new constitution, but there's no agreement about what is the best way. And I know you can't give me any clear answer, but maybe you have some thoughts.
Maybe we should go for a round of answers. Charlotte or Mariana, I don't know who
I think
wants to start.
Charlotte wants to also about a dictatorship.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like somewhere in my notes, I wrote dictator, but I did not use it. So I must admit I rarely use this term, but I usually would use it like for a closed autocratic system. Like we have like this electoral autocratic system. Yeah, but I mean this is but I prefer authoritarian leader. But
yes, maybe it's a bias of our project, but we decided to concentrate on countries that have done some form of transition to democracy in the early 90s. So it doesn't mean that dictatorships or authoritarian regimes do not have term limits. Some of them do have them. If they respect them or not is something different, but they also have kind of constitutions where they base. but this is not the object of our study. We wanted to look more on these countries that have done some sort of transition, that had adopted many of them a new constitution with term limits, or reassumed the old constitutions like in Latin America, and to explore what had happened with that. So that's more or less, we can't do anything, so we decided to concentrate on those countries.
Okay. Maybe I pick some of the questions about Siri's question about the level of democracy or regime type and the type of term limit or type of reforms. So, I mean, what is quite clear that most of the countries that abolished the term limits at one point, these are usually like the rather autocratic regimes, while those with the stables are the rather democratic regimes. And then we have the gray zone with the electoral democracies and autocracies, and there the trend is, as far as I remember, not that clear, because they are also like some moving forth and back, and still like Chad was just introducing a term limit, and I mean this still it's an authoritarian regime. And quickly about Uganda. So, I mean, it's in our data set, but I'm not I do not consider myself as an expert of Uganda. But I mean, they had a term limit, and then they Museveni eliminated the term limit again. He was also bribing during this vote. As far as I know, he was also bribing several MPs so that they vote for the constitutional amendment. And I think the last reform was also about removing the age limit. So he has still chances to stay. And and maybe also adding to Siri about this, maybe constitutions work this way. So here I want to bring my Senegal example, because Senegal actually has a long history of term limits. The first time they introduced term limits in the 1970s, but then they changed it several times. And Senegal experienced now in the last 3 decades 2 electoral turnovers, but it was never due to the term limit. Actually, the term limit was never respected. But, and this maybe links to Siri's suggestions, like when you look at the reports, you see that the term limits is becoming more prominent in the debate. And today, like also in 2012, the term limit was not respected, but in the end, it was popular protest and the people who did not re-elect Ward. And then it was also during the campaign, many people were talking about the term limit. So there is some effect of the term limit, even though it did not force the people to step down, the presidents to step down. Yeah.
I think you had Lisa as well.
The institutional changes. Yeah, sorry. So this was a question like how it.
Want me to repeat it?
Pardon?
Want me to repeat the question?
Yeah, I think it was like
so
which.
Basically, I was asking, what do you see follow-up changes?
Yeah.
Once you have a term limit,
Yeah.
does other institutional changes follow?
Yeah.
And changes to executive powers.
Yeah. Okay. So we also looked to other reform measures. So usually, like in many cases, it's not only the term limit that is reformed, but there are often packages. Like a very popular package in Africa is also to combine it with the length of the presidential term. So there are different compromises are possible, but it's also possible to link it to bigger reforms. For instance, there's a paper by Baturu and LG where they also show that it's actually it often comes together with the introduction of senates. So, and they say this is actually a way to mask other reforms increasing presidential powers. So, but like I think the beginning of your question was that if you defend the term limits, so if it's not changed, then usually there are no other changes because like the constitution remains usually stable. But
Yes, the same in Latin America. I would say that there are many reforms in which the motor of the change was a term limit, but many other things changed as well. And But in the latest reforms are, in that sense, in the last 15 years, they are much worse in that sense that the president look only to that point and try to reform that point. The earlier reforms were more like broader, I would say. Maybe you... And the other question was on... I like your question, but now...
Which design is good for state?
Which design is... Of course. Each design... what is... yes, it's very difficult to say this is good and this is bad. But what we know is that each design has effects. Because because the actors build their incentives according to the expectations that this rule allows. So the design that most of the people agree that is not the good one is the indefinite re-election. At least in Latin America, it doesn't result very democratic in the end because we know that this cut the reform to a person. But there are other kind of reforms. So the typical ones are you stay for one re-election, then step down, and then you can come back. And this reform also has its own consequences, which are not always positive. We have a friend of ours, Javier Corrales, you may know him, who has argued a little bit against that type of term limit as well, because if the presidents know that they step down, but they can come back anytime in the future, they remain active, we could say, in the political system. And when these big figures remain active, they don't invest in building like new political leaders or building a new generation of leadership in their own party. So the investment in the party building is less, we could say. So so I wouldn't say that this is good or this is bad, but each type of reform we could argue have some kind of effects, and in some sense or the others, some positive effects and some not so positive. But I'm pro one re-election. I think I like the idea of having one re-election because this is a way to make the president also accountable. So if he's running and if he's running well, he will get another term. But then he should step down, I think.
Good. There is 2 minutes left. If someone has a very short question which can be answered very shortly, we will allow it.
So
yeah.
we know what Mariana thinks.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, Charlotte. Mariana has given her preferred design. Now come with yours, and there is one question, and then the answers, and then we
I think I also think that the 2-term limit is a good compromise, and then I also think, or I'm waiting that we are discussing more term limits for parliamentary systems, because I mean, we talked about the logic that it should work, but like as we observe in Germany, I have the feeling it does not work, and we also see the effect that the opposition is getting weaker, and also not strong people in the ruling party are not really growing, and I think we need to talk more about it.
Okay, one short question. There's 1 minute left. Short question, short answer.
The concentration on purely on term limits is problematic, because we're looking at countries, especially in Latin America, where we have forms of deformed democratic systems, where based on some class elite power and powerful economic elites who maintain power, aided by elite legal institutions, the media, not least foreign intervention. And we're looking at a difference between types of systems where a popular president with a large social base is looking for systematic change, and situations where you have governments which are merely trying to maintain the status quo and class interests. So putting, for example, Honduras and Bolivia in the same box is a bit simple because there are different things there. Is it more democratic, for example, what happened in Ecuador, where a president is elected on the base of a reform which has been going on for years, and when he comes to power, he completely changes the rules of the game. So it's a bit more complicated.
Yes.
Really.
Mariana, do you
I
want
agree.
to comment?
No, I answer. I agree.
Okay, on that happy note.
Because it's a very difficult question, and we in 1 minute. But I agree that's much more complicated. That just talking about term limits.
Yep. Good. On that happy note, I thank you all for coming this morning. And I thank Mariana and Charlotte for talking with us on term limits and democracy in Latin America and Africa. And just want to give them a final last applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.